So hi, I'm Prathul. I'm just going to be talking about thought, which is a very general topic if you think about it. If you think about it, aren't we all thinking about thought at all times? So it's kind of like a reductory statement. I'm going to be talking about thought, but I do feel like it's a very fascinating conversation that has been happening for a long time. When it comes to human consciousness and just understanding the world around us. So for my capstone, I was reading this text for the past 2 weeks called Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, in which this is basically an existentialist text, which is just a fancy way of saying that it deals with, questions about our purpose in life, our meaning in life, and stuff along those same lines. And the reason the text is called the Myth of Sisyphus, it's derived from this Greek mythology that Camus uses. And it's the story about this one guy who was cursed by the gods to roll a piece of rock up a mountain, roll a boulder up a mountain. But the moment he takes that boulder, he rolls it, he takes all his effort to roll it up the mountain, he has to see it roll back down again. And then he goes back and then he pushes it up again. And the moment he reaches the top, the boulder goes back to the bottom. And he's stuck in this endless cycle, this endless loop of just this futile exercise which has no meaning at the end, right? Because if you're going to be doing the same thing over and over again without any particular end result, that's a form of torture, which is what the gods intended for him in this mythology. They intended to punish him, which is why they gave him they made him stuck inside a loop. And I feel like the reason that Camus uses this example is because he's trying to say that how even though we don't realize it, we are in a very similar situation to Sisyphus, in the sense that we keep rolling this boulder all across our life. We take it to the top of the mountain, only to see it roll down and then start the whole process again. So the way I was thinking about it is like on a very broad sense, right? The universe was created a few billion years ago. There was nothing, and then there was a Big Bang. And then everything that ever happened, everything that is happening right now, and everything that will ever happen started from that event, started from that moment. There was no time as we know it before that event. And that happened. And it is such, like the world, the universe as we know it, was created then. And now I have to wake up every morning, go to school, go back at home, go to sleep, and then do the same thing over and over again every day, right? Like what happened from that point in history where everything was created to where we are right now, that we've gotten so lost in what the world is around us that we're just focusing on these abstract concepts that we created for ourselves. So when you think about this story, the myth of Sisyphus, would you consider it a tragic story or would you consider it a happy story? Usually the connotation behind it is that it's a tragedy, right? In the sense that he's being punished, he's stuck there, and he's just doing the same thing over and over again. It's so sad, right? But Camus argues that it's only a tragedy once he becomes aware of his own condition, right? Think about it. If you have a cat or a dog, and they're at home, they have the same schedule. You feed them, you take them on a walk, they go home, they sleep. They're not aware of their surroundings. They're not aware of their life. They're not aware what's happening around them. They don't have the ability, right? But for us, we actually do have that ability. And in that sense, once we become aware of the life we're living, once we get this sense of self-awareness, which Camus called lucidity, then actually our suffering starts. And it's very fascinating because another way to think about it, it's like a prison of our own making, except we're always in that prison. But just the fact that we don't think about it means we are not like entrapped. But the moment we become aware of it, the moment we actually start thinking, the moment we actually start looking at the world around us, we realize we are actually in a prison of our own making. And I will elaborate on this further. So one example I was thinking of is that this is the question that was asked to me by my little brother. And I'm sure if you've been around little kids, they have this really annoying habit of just being like, why? You're talking to them about anything and they just respond with why. So I was having a conversation with my little brother and I'm like, you shouldn't eat ice cream for breakfast or something along those lines. And he's like, why? And I'm like, it's not good for your health. And he's like, why? And I'm like, it's because, you're gonna become more unhealthy and that's not a good way to lead your life. He asks, why? And at that point, me personally, I lost my patience. But what my little brother was asking were the same existential questions that Camus is asking, except he wasn't aware of it, I wasn't aware of it. But if I actually did indulge him in his, quest for answers, if he kept asking me why to every answer I gave him, soon I would reach a point where I couldn't actually give him an answer. I couldn't give him an explanation to his question of why, right? Like, think about it. We go from don't eat ice cream before going to sleep. Why? It's bad for your health. Why? We should strive to be healthy. Why? Because, you don't want to die early. Why? Right? And sure, you can come up with an answer to that. And the question of why always remains, right? And I feel like this question, this point we reach in our line of reasoning where we don't have an answer for that why, that's what Camus described as the absurd, right? You reach a point in your logical reasoning where you realize that what I know, the structures I build my life around, the reasoning, the logic, which I think are so core to the human condition, don't actually make sense. And the reason that we don't actually pay attention to it, as Camus described, is because we get in a habit of living before we get in a habit of thinking, right? If we were to get into a habit of thinking before we got in a habit of living, we would realize that a lot of things that we do in life are very trivial, are constructs created by ourselves. Moving on, Camus talks about basically, there's two major concepts that are integral to this line of thought. Two truths, you can call them. One of them being that our mind, we have this need to find unity with the world. We have this need inside us to find meaning in our life, find a place in our life. And it's always been there. Even we might be aware of it, we might not be aware of it, it might be subconscious, unconscious, but it's always there. We have this need to find our place in this world, make it make sense. But on the other hand, the world in itself is unreasonable. And I think that's the important word, unreasonable. The world is not rational, the world is not irrational, the world is unreasonable. Like, there's no point having this discussion because the discussion is not possible to have due to the way the world works. And a good way to think about it is, when you think of a tiger, and a tiger is killing a deer or is eating a deer, would you consider it moral or immoral? Right? And I feel like the answer to that would be neither. It's amoral. It exists outside of morality because the tiger has no ability to think that what I'm doing is right or wrong. The tiger just eats because the tiger has this need to survive. And it's the same with either being rational or irrational. It's neither. It's unreasonable. The discussion about rationality, irrationality can't come into play because we as humans don't have the ability to actually understand the concepts we're talking about, right? And there's so much about the world around us that we don't know that we just work on assumptions, Maybe, like Descartes said, the whole world is just a dream inside the head of a demon who wants to torture us or something, right? Any hypothetical scenario you can think of. Maybe the world is like the Matrix. We're all living inside a simulation. Maybe the world is a movie and we're all characters inside it, right? The point being that we don't know. And since we don't know, we build our understanding of this world around assumptions, around hypotheticals. And the reason for that, like I said before, is because we get in a habit of living before we get in a habit of thinking. Because if we actually do question the world around us, if we do actually question what everything means, what our place is, we'll realize that we don't have an answer. And like that hypothetical example I gave of a little annoying kid just keep asking you why and why. Camus asked the same question. He just kept going deeper and deeper, and he kept asking why. And you reach that point, you reach that dead end where we don't know. And I think that's what's really important to Camus' line of thinking. How can you build your life around something you don't understand, right? Which is why he says that at first, we need to establish our truths. We need to establish what we know for certain we know about the world. And for Camus, the only two things that make sense, everything else in the world could be a lie. There's only two things that make sense. Number one is that death is a part of every person's life. Every living organism can't exist without death. Life only has meaning if death is there. Without death, what is life, right? It's a very relational relationship, which doesn't make sense, but they are very closely related to each other. And the second one being, like I said earlier, is that the world is absurd. No matter what effort we do, no matter how much time we give to try to understand, the fact of the matter is we can't, because the world transcends our experience. Another example he gave was to think about it, that all human thought is anthropomorphic, in the sense that it's very related to humans. So how can we claim to understand a universe that has existed so long before us, that will exist so long after us? How can we claim to understand it when our only relation to that is through our life, right? The universe doesn't care whether we're humans, whether we evolved from monkeys. The universe just has its truth. And for us to make sense of that, we try to compare it to human life. We try to compare it to human relations, because that's how we see the world. But that's not actually how the world works objectively. And I feel like that's a very fascinating thing to think about. Another thing that Camus mentioned, which I found very fascinating, is that he said that while we do have limited freedom, while we do have limited liberty, we are all slaves of our own liberty. And the example he gives is that since we don't have a purpose, we don't have a given purpose for our life from, let's say, God or whatever, we are at the liberty to choose our own purpose, right? Which means that hypothetically I can choose, I want to do philosophy, I want to study this philosophy, I give myself that purpose. And from that purpose, I build boundaries around myself. But the fact of the matter is they're all hypothetical imaginary boundaries. They don't exist unless I make them exist, because there is no inherent purpose. And in that sense, we become slaves to our own choice, to the own choice we make of giving ourselves our own purpose. And we're just stuck in that. So how did this self-awareness that we have, how did this come about? And looking at the theory of evolution, we gain this ability to be aware of our surroundings because of danger. Because we would be threatened by animals, and we would be adapted to get this sense of what's going on around us. The absurd for Camus is just the same thing, just taken from a really far back perspective. He's not saying look at your life just from what's happening right now, but look at your life from a perspective of how old the world actually is, how much we don't know. And when you gain that perspective, when you realize that there's nothing you actually understand about the world, that's when Camus says that you've actually found your truth. When you accept the fact that you don't actually know anything, when you accept the fact that everything about the world around us we don't understand, that's when you actually become, I don't want to say a better person, but that's when you actually understand the world, right? The fact that I don't understand is my understanding. And it is kind of a contradictory statement, but that is what the absurd is all about. And yeah, Camus' response at the end of the day, you ask yourself, so what's the point? We don't actually know anything about the world around us, we don't understand it. So what's the point of living? And to that, Camus responds that you have to revolt. Because if you think about it, there is nothing more beautiful than a mind which is trying to understand the world around it. But it literally can't, because the world transcends any experience the mind could have. And so it's this really contrasting relationship. It's like a one-sided crush, or like, when you love a person but a person doesn't love you back. The mind always wants the sense of unity. The mind wants answers, and the world cannot provide them. That's just the way it is. And once we recognize that, once we accept that, that's when we actually understand what Camus is talking about. That's when we realize that, the world is actually beautiful, but we just have to accept we don't know anything about it. Thank you.